Inside the church, there can also be great contrast in how attitudes and personalities and things like hospitality and kindness and gentleness and warmth can be expressed or not expressed. There can be night and day differences between one person and another, one church and another. And when it comes to being Christ-centered and God-centered in a way that honors Him, we want to look a certain way. And we saw last week with a man named Caius, that Caius, if you recall from our story last week in John, John's writing a letter to Caius and said, hey, Caius, there are some strangers, but the strangers had a mission to proclaim Christ in your town. They came to your town. You were very hospitable. You took them in. You provided for them. You probably provided ministry opportunities for them. You probably provided some finances for them as they left. You supported them in their call to minister the gospel. And so John wrote the letter back to Caius and says, way to go. Stay faithful in that. That's a good thing. You're doing the right thing. And I'm so encouraged to see you walking in what? Truth and love. Caius was like that. Okay? That was kind of fun to preach about Caius. But this morning, it's the other side of the coin, if you will. It's the the light and the darkness. It's the darkness. Not everyone's like that in the church, and John experienced that in the church. And so, this morning we look at another individual that John has to write and address in the church, and his name is Diotrephes, and we see in verse 9 of this letter where John has to address someone completely different than Caius. As I see John writing this teaching to Caius, then we know this morning, as the Spirit of God has made the Word living, that Water's Edge, then we are to warn, guard, and protect ourselves from evil influence in the church, however it may display itself, but I would say especially if it rears its head among leadership or some leading voice or someone spreading influence in a way that captures people in the church that leads them off in the darkness and not into light. And so we must warn, guard, and protect ourselves from that kind of influence in the church. I really see 5 marks of ungodly or evil conduct in the church that I want to identify, because John identifies this for us to be warned about. 5 marks of ungodly or evil conduct in the church that we do not want to imitate or allow its influence upon us in any way. Number 1. Ungodly leadership or ungodly conduct is marked by self-centeredness. Ungodly conduct in the church will be marked by self-centeredness. Where do I see that? In verse 9, John writes, I've written this letter to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself what? First. He likes to put himself first. In other words, there's a self-centered desire to be first, to be in control, to be the one seen with a spotlight on him. And so when we see someone who's self-centered, the heart of the problem here in this situation is a heart of sin. If self is on the throne, by definition, that means that God is not on the throne. Number 2, a second ungodly mark inside the church of evil conduct is pride. It's pride. John says in verse 9, same verse, he says that Diotrephes does not acknowledge our authority. He simply will not acknowledge authority. He doesn't want anybody over him. Usually if you're self-centered and you want to be in control, then once again, back to submission, you do not want to submit to other people. You don't want to look at people that have authority over you. And so you find some reason to not be underneath that authority and not be underneath that submission. And typically it goes back to a prideful heart. Well, a third mark of ungodly leadership or ungodly conduct in the church that's evil is division. That's the word I'm using, division, but you'll see how the division plays out. In verse 10, John writes, listen, Diotrephes, he says, I will bring up what he is doing. I'm going to confront him, other words, when I get there. But he says he's doing this. He's talking wicked nonsense against us. He is talking wicked nonsense against us. Your translation might say a malicious type of gossip. He's not trying to build people up, right? He's trying to tear people down. There's a difference. We went through James, and James talked about the tongue, right? The tongue is such a small little piece of our body, but it has such power, right? Why? Because it can either build up and edify, it can either bless people, or it can what? Blast people. It can tear people apart. The tongue can be so painful and so damaging to relationships. And Diotrephes is doing that very thing. He's saying all kind of wicked nonsense, malicious gossip against John, probably the disciples that had come to teach and preach the gospel there. And so John calls him out, and he says, when I get there, I will confront such a behavior in the church. Here's the fourth mark of ungodly leadership or evil in the church is inhospitality. So I mentioned self-centeredness, pride, division, like tied to gossip, but then also inhospitality. And so it tells us here in John that Diotrephes refused to welcome the brothers in verse 10. These are the same camp. He said, hey, this Diotrephes, he won't even welcome the brothers. He is inhospitable. The very contrast to Caius, right? Who welcomed them in, took care of them. He's inhospitable. And so you can almost say he's rude. Inhospitable, rude. But number 5, he even goes further. Check this out. Ungodly leadership is marked by relational destruction. Kind of two big words there. What do I mean by that? Ungodly leadership is marked by relational destruction. In other words, evil conduct, evil type of leadership, if it's not centered in Christ and has all these other sin issues, then it will be about destroying relationships, not building them up. Verse 11. The context here is so important. I don't know how we can in any way separate these things together. Talking about Diotrephes, and he says this, beloved, talking about Caius. Caius, my brother in Christ, I love you dearly. He says, do not imitate what? Evil, but imitate good. So I believe John is speaking about this behavior in Diotrephes. We don't wrestle against people. We wrestle against the powers in darkness, right? But this kind of sinful behavior in Diotrephes, he sees it and defines it as evil, which means it's not from above, it's from below. It's from the heart of a sinful man, and not from the heart of God.